Good morning. This morning we look at Joshua chapter 9, verse 3 to 16. I must warn you before we begin that it's an extremely challenging passage and may leave you slightly unsettled by the time we've finished. Nevertheless, there's some important questions to answer. First up is this: do your prayers follow your actions, or do your actions follow your prayers? If you're praying after you've acted, it's often because we've run ahead of God. If you're acting after you've prayed, it's a whole different story, and you're probably well on track. We join the passage at verse 3. At this moment, we have Joshua and the men of Israel at a strange moment of relative peace, after having routed everybody they've encountered and followed to the letter every instruction that God has given them. The Gibeonites, people who live very close by, understand what's waiting for them, and so they decide to deceive Joshua and the Israelites. They get dressed up in old clothes and they get old moldy food, and they present themselves to the men of Israel and ask for a treaty. It's not that they're not questioned. It's not that the Israelites aren't suspicious of them. But it is interesting that they took everything they said at face value. Their eyes very clearly on the evidence that was before them. And that's where the problem lies. It's when we get to verse 14 that we find out what the real problem is. It says, "So the Israelite men partook of their food and did not consult the Lord. Joshua made peace with them, covenanting with them to let them live, and the assembly's leaders swore to them. Then, 3 days after they had made a covenant with the strangers, the Israelites heard that they were neighbors and that they dwelt among them." Before we start examining this, I'd like to first go to Jeremiah 17, verse 9. It's a very famous passage, and the part that most people focus on is, "I know the plans I have for you, plans to give you a future." But there's a verse just a little bit earlier, and this is it. It says, "The heart is more deceitful than all else and is desperately sick. Who can understand it?" I mentioned this verse about the deceitfulness of the heart of men. And I asked the question, why did Joshua not check with God first? Joshua is one of the good guys, one of the people that we look up to as having obeyed God to the letter. And yet we find Joshua at a moment of extreme weakness and making a mistake that would cost the Israelites centuries of heartache and trouble. Why did Joshua not check with God first? Of all the people you might have expected to do it, Joshua would have been the one, and yet he didn't. I think the answer comes from Proverbs 3, verse 5. The Bible is full of verses like this. "Trust in the Lord with all your heart and do not depend on your own understanding." What we find Joshua doing right now is depending on his own understanding. Far worse than that, he's not trusting in the Lord with all his heart. Him and the Israelites are looking at their success, and in the moment of quietly probably congratulating themselves on having obeyed God and done all that he'd asked. When reflecting on everything that's happened, having looked back at a job well done, see traces of pride probably creeping in. And off guard, Joshua and the men of Israel don't trust God with all their hearts, and they don't depend on him, but they lean on their own understanding. Proverbs 29:23 drives it home. A person's pride will bring about his downfall, but the humble in spirit will gain honor. When we think of Joshua, we don't think of him as a proud man. We think of him as humble, someone who walked before God, who listened. It just goes to show, if the mighty Joshua is weak and susceptible to such things, how much then more are we? It seems that it's really easy for us to forget that everything we have, everything we've accomplished, everything we've ever done has been done with the help of the Lord. Joshua and the Israelites had just a short while ago marched around a city, and the walls of Jericho had come tumbling down without the men lifting a finger. Here we find them just a short while later, forgetting that they were so dependent on God. The human heart and mind seems to love to take a moment after success to reflect and take some of the glory for ourselves. It seems to be the natural way of the heart and mind of a man. But God expects more from us. And so we're called to remember that our help comes from the Lord. He made the heaven and the earth, and we're absolutely and totally dependent on Him for everything. One of the realities we're not ready for when we read this passage is that there are consequences for every choice we make. And the fact is that these consequences of taking our lives into our own hands don't go away. Joshua and the Israelites had to live with the consequences of their mistake. The people paid for it with centuries of difficulty and hardship. I wonder how many mistakes you can think of that you've made where you've run ahead of God, where you've prayed after the fact, asked Him to bless something that you've done. Those consequences are still with you. It is true, though, that God does give us the grace and the strength to deal with whatever is with us, but it's not His first choice for your life. His choice is for you to ask Him first, and in dependence on Him to act and to obey. It's pretty hard and difficult stuff, but the blessing of following what God has asked you to do far outweighs all the trouble and the difficulty it would take to ask Him first.